With more infections discovered today, the Cedar Meats outbreak has now left to 49 people being infected. Even though the first patient was identified more than a month ago and the Victorian Health Department failed to declare it an exposure site. A few minutes ago, I caught up with Victorian opposition leader Michael O'Brien and asked him why he said this was Daniel Andrews' Ruby Princess episode.
Yeah, well, Chris, it's the biggest coronavirus cluster in Victoria, 50 cases and counting. Now, the question is, when the first case was identified on the 2nd of April, why did it take 3 weeks for the contract tracing to be done before further cases became apparent? And also, why is it that when this government has named primary schools, hospitals, aged care facilities, put their names out there for the public to see, why was the government so keen to keep secret the name Cedar Meats? And did it have anything to do with the fact that Cedar Meats had donated $15,000 to the Victorian Labor Party just before Daniel Andrews became Premier?
I'll come back to that naming issue in a moment, but the first point is whether or not the appropriate tracing was done. Obviously now, in hindsight, it wasn't. We've had a similar situation really with the Ruby Princess. If you had that situation over again in New South Wales, you would never have let those people off that ship without testing, without isolation. More should have been done with Cedar Meats, but isn't this typical of the early stages of this outbreak, if you like? We need to learn now that whenever there is an outbreak, there are fewer of them, of course, happening these days, but we've just got to absolutely get onto them, drill down into that social tracing and stamp them out.
Well, you're right, Chris, but the question is, how was the ball dropped in these circumstances, which has led to so many people being infected and doing so much damage? You had one person, one employee was diagnosed back in early April. Why immediately weren't his workmates informed? Why wasn't the workplace tested and cleaned? Why did it take another 3 weeks before that sort of action occurred? And you have to say, was it competent? Clearly it wasn't. But, you know, is this a systematic problem that is right throughout the Victorian public health response to this, or was this a one-off? All we know, though, is that we've got 50 people tested positive for COVID-19, and frankly, if the right processes had been in place from the start, that shouldn't have happened.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with that. It just shouldn't happen. Every workplace around the country, we all know that. You find an infected staff member, then everyone's out. You check it all the way out, especially in food processing, I would have thought. Now, I want to come to this naming issue, though, because we do have onerous privacy rules around a lot of government activities, but surely when you identify a food processing company where there has been a COVID-19 infection identified, the public has a right to know immediately the name of that company.
Well, you would think so, Chris, and as I mentioned, the government's been very quick to pull the trigger and name primary schools and aged care facilities and hospitals.
As they should.
The question is, absolutely, because these businesses don't operate in a bubble. People go into them, people come out of them. You've got truck drivers, you've got couriers, you've got all sorts of people, you've got inspectors, you've got all sorts of people who interact with this business on a daily basis. If this business is the source of a COVID-19 outbreak, those people not only have a duty, they have a right to understand that they may have been put at risk, and it's in their interest and the public health interest for them to be tested. You can't do that if the government's covering up the name of the source of the outbreak.
Now, isn't it most likely, of course, that the cover-up of the name is a matter of trying to abide by these privacy rules that are right across the private sector, public sector, I should say, rather than covering up for Labor donations and the like that you're suggesting?
Well, Chris, I'm not sure about that because Brett Sutton, who's Victoria's Chief Health Officer, he was asked on radio last week about who makes the decision about naming, and he made clear it wasn't just his decision. He says it's me and the government. So the government has a role in this. Daniel Andrews was trying to run away from that the other day, but according to Brett Sutton, it's a joint decision between the government and the Chief Health Officer. So the question is, when every other major source of an outbreak has been named by the government, what is so special about Cedar Meats that it was treated so differently from everywhere else?
OK, to the future now, and that outbreak aside at Cedar Meats, the infection rates around the country are right down. Obviously, state and federal governments, all sorts of authorities, Australians have done a great job of suppressing this outbreak. National Cabinet's meeting on Friday to finalise some ways to free up the economy. How far should they go? Victoria is likely to be the state that gives the least ground here. Surely it's time to open up businesses, get this society going again and protect livelihoods.
Look, Chris, Victoria is the lockdown state compared to the rest of the country. We're the state that's not sending our kids back to school when other states are. We're the state where you can't do recreational fishing, hunting, play golf, even though you can do that in other states safely. So Daniel Andrews has gone harder and harsher than any other state premier. What's been the outcome? Well, the ABS data came out yesterday that showed Victoria has lost more jobs in the period between March and April than any other state. So there's no doubt that having the harshest lockdown laws in the country is affecting not just the economy, it affects people's mental health.
Well, the lockdown doesn't help much when you don't follow up on an outbreak at a meat processing centre. But it's specifically what sorts of things need to be opened up. Obviously, everybody needs to get back to school. They never should have been closed. But golf, picnics, bars, restaurants, what rules do you want to see freed up?
Yeah. Look, I think some of the things that I think are actually important are they're emotional as well as economic. Funerals, for example, I think the limit of only 10 people being able to attend a funeral, when you consider what many churches look like, the amount of space they have, you can fit a lot more people than 10 in at a funeral service and observe social distancing. I think some common sense would see some improvements on that. When you look at things like restaurants and cafes, I don't see why you can't have a small amount of table service spread out so that social distancing is observed, but let these businesses have a go. We've got too many businesses that are on life support at the moment. They're hanging by a thread. We need to see some glimmer of hope. We need to see some opportunity for a safe return to a little bit of normality. So I think in terms of hospitality, there's some opportunities there, recreational activities in Victoria, and certainly back to school, absolutely essential.